What if the person you were about to marry wasn't the one your heart truly loved? Just moments before Quan's engagement, a deadly accident forces Shaolac to risk her own life to save him, unlocking the memories he thought were lost forever and exposing a heartbreaking truth that changes everyone's fate. If you love emotional drama stories like this, be sure to subscribe and join us for today's unforgettable episode. Today we're continuing this emotional roller coaster story about Ly Tu Tieu and the tangled web of love, lies, and lost memories. If you haven't caught the previous parts, make sure to go watch those first because this one picks up right after Quan starts uncovering the truth. Grab your tissues because things are about to get intense. Let's dive in. The decision had finally been made. Not long after Quan was discharged from the hospital, both families arranged a formal meeting and agreed to hold the engagement ceremony within the next 2 weeks. It was never a rushed decision. In fact, the engagement had already been planned long before the accident happened. Now everyone believed that moving forward with it would help Quan regain his confidence and return to his normal life. To both families, it seemed like the perfect solution. Trinh couldn't have been happier. For days, her smile never left her face. She threw herself into every detail of the celebration, carefully choosing elegant gowns, luxurious floral arrangements, and the most prestigious 5-star venue in the city. Every appointment, every fitting, every decoration became another step toward the future she had dreamed about. She imagined herself standing beside Quan in front of everyone, officially becoming the woman who would spend the rest of her life with him. Everything was finally falling into place. At least, that was what she believed. Quan, however, felt something completely different. The closer the engagement came, the heavier his heart became. He couldn't explain why. Every time Trinh sat beside him, smiling as she talked about their future together, he listened politely. She reminded him of old stories. She showed him photographs. Newspaper articles announcing their engagement lay neatly on the table, proving that everything she said was real. The evidence was there. The family supported it. The media had reported it. On paper, everything made perfect sense. Yet somewhere deep inside, something refused to accept it. A strange emptiness lingered in his chest. It felt as though an important chapter of his life had disappeared, leaving behind only blank pages that no one else could see. Whenever Trinh laughed, he smiled out of courtesy. Whenever she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. But the warmth he expected to feel never came. Instead, there was only silence. An uncomfortable silence that grew louder every single day. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he would wake from dreams he couldn't remember. There would be fragments. A girl's laughter, the smell of homemade soup, warm yellow lights shining inside a tiny apartment, a soft voice calling his name. Every time he tried to hold on to those memories, they vanished before he could recognize the face connected to them. It left him frustrated, confused, almost afraid. Still, he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing everyone who had been waiting for this day. His parents looked relieved whenever they talked about the engagement. Trin's parents treated him like family already. Even Trinh herself seemed genuinely excited. How could he suddenly refuse when he couldn't even explain what was bothering him? After several days of hesitation, Quan finally nodded. Maybe, he thought quietly to himself, once this is over, everything will become clear. But even after agreeing to the engagement, he couldn't ignore the questions inside his heart. So while everyone else focused on preparing for the ceremony, Quan began investigating his own forgotten past. Without telling Trinh or either family, he contacted his trusted assistant, Min. "I need your help," Quan said over the phone one evening. "I'm listening, Mr. Quan." "I want everything you can find about Shaolac." There was a brief silence on the other end. "The woman who visited you at the hospital?" "Yes. I'll start immediately." "Don't leave out anything." After ending the call, Quan remained seated alone inside his study. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock. On his desk lay a photograph that had somehow survived the chaos following his accident. Beside it were handwritten notes, appointment records, and pieces of information Min had already begun collecting. Quan picked up the photo once again. Although the image itself didn't unlock any memories, it stirred emotions that refused to disappear. He stared at Shaolac's smiling face for a long time. Why did looking at her make his heart ache? Why did her smile feel so familiar? Why did seeing her tears at the hospital hurt him far more than he could explain? Night after night, he studied every document. Every new detail only strengthened one conclusion. Before the accident, Shaolac had been incredibly important to him. There were too many connections to ignore, too many moments where their lives had overlapped, too many people who remembered seeing them together. Yet strangely, Trinh had almost never mentioned Shaolac. Whenever Quan asked about her, Trinh always brushed the topic aside. She's just someone who misunderstood your kindness. She became emotionally attached. You don't need to worry about her. At first, Quan accepted those explanations. Now, they no longer sounded convincing. The more he searched, the more obvious it became that there was an entire part of his life missing, a part connected to Shaolac. Meanwhile, Trinh slowly noticed the change. Quan had become quieter, more distant. His eyes often wandered somewhere far away during conversations. Sometimes she caught him staring absent-mindedly at nothing. Sometimes she noticed him leaving the room to answer phone calls he never explained. She smiled exactly as she always had. Gentle, elegant, understanding. But behind that perfect smile, anxiety was growing stronger every day. She couldn't allow Shaolac to become part of Quan's life again. Not now. Not after everything she had worked so hard to protect. If Quan recovered his memories completely, everything could collapse. So she decided it was time to deal with the situation herself. A few days before the engagement ceremony, Trinh sent Shaolac a message asking if they could meet. The location was familiar, the small cafe where they had spoken once before. Shaolac hesitated after reading the invitation. Part of her wanted to refuse. She already knew another conversation with Trinh would only reopen wounds she had been trying desperately to heal. Still, she agreed. Perhaps this would finally bring everything to an end. That afternoon, Shaolac arrived first. She sat quietly near the window, wrapping both hands around a warm cup of coffee that had already begun to cool. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalk. Inside, soft music filled the silence. Several minutes later, Trinh walked in. She looked graceful as always. Her makeup was flawless. Her smile was calm. Anyone watching them would think they were simply two acquaintances meeting for coffee. Trinh sat down across from Shaolac. Neither of them spoke immediately. After ordering a drink, Trinh slowly reached into her handbag. She removed an elegant cream-colored envelope decorated with delicate gold lettering. Without saying a word, she placed it gently on the table. The envelope slid toward Shaolac. Curious, Shaolac lowered her eyes. The moment she recognized what it was, her fingers froze. An engagement invitation. Her heartbeat stopped for a split second. Trinh folded her hands neatly before speaking in a soft, almost affectionate voice. Quan and I are getting engaged. She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. I thought you deserved to know. Shaolac stared at the invitation in silence. The gold letters blurred as tears threatened to fill her eyes. She fought hard to remain composed. Trinh continued speaking, her tone polite, yet carrying an unmistakable meaning beneath every word. I hope you'll come. I'm sure Quan would be happy to receive your blessing. The sentence sounded kind, but Shaolac understood exactly what Trinh intended. This wasn't simply an invitation. It was a reminder, a declaration, a final confirmation that the man Shaolac loved was about to belong to someone else. Slowly, Shaolac picked up the invitation. Her fingers tightened around its edges until her knuckles turned white. For several long seconds, she couldn't find her voice. She wanted to decline. She wanted to stand up and walk away. She wanted to pretend none of this mattered anymore. Instead, she lowered her eyes and gave the smallest nod. I'll come. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I just want to see him happy, even if that happiness wasn't with her. Trinh watched her quietly. A faint smile appeared on her lips, exactly the answer she had expected. Outside the cafe window, gray clouds slowly gathered across the afternoon sky. Neither woman noticed, or perhaps neither of them cared. The engagement day was drawing closer, and with every passing hour, destiny was quietly preparing to change all of their lives forever. The morning of the engagement arrived beneath a sky washed in pale sunlight, as if the city itself had dressed for the occasion. From the entrance of the five-star hotel to the grand ballroom on the top floor, every detail reflected elegance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, towering flower arrangements lined the marble corridors, and soft classical music drifted through the air. Staff members moved gracefully from table to table, making final adjustments before the guests arrived. The ballroom quickly filled with laughter and polite conversation. Business partners exchanged handshakes. Relatives congratulated one another. Friends raised glasses, celebrating what everyone believed was the beginning of a beautiful future. To every guest present, it looked like the perfect engagement ceremony. Only the groom knew something was missing. Quân stood near the center of the ballroom, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. His appearance was impeccable, and he greeted every guest with the calm confidence everyone expected from him. Whenever someone congratulated him, he smiled. Whenever photographers asked him to pose beside Trinh, he cooperated without complaint. His expressions were flawless, yet none of those smiles ever reached his eyes. Inside, an invisible weight pressed heavily against his chest. The decorations were breathtaking. The music was beautiful. The applause was warm. But the emptiness within him refused to disappear. Every few minutes, his gaze wandered unconsciously toward the ballroom entrance. He didn't even realize he was doing it. It felt as though he were waiting for someone he couldn't remember, someone his heart recognized long before his memories did. Nearby, Trinh noticed every glance. She wore an elegant white evening gown that shimmered beneath the crystal lights. Diamonds sparkled around her neck, and her makeup was flawless. She looked exactly like the bride everyone admired. Whenever photographers approached, she leaned naturally beside Quân, resting her hand lightly on his arm. Every photograph captured the image of a perfect couple. At least, that was what the cameras saw. Deep inside, Trinh couldn't ignore the growing fear. Quân wasn't looking at her. He was searching for someone else. She forced herself to smile even brighter. Today had to succeed. Everything depended on it. If this ceremony ended smoothly, if the rings were exchanged, if both families officially announced the engagement, then no one could take Quân away from her. She repeated those thoughts over and over until she almost believed them herself. Across the city, Shaolac stood quietly before a mirror inside her small apartment. The invitation rested on the table beside her. She had almost decided not to go. Several times she reached for her phone, intending to send a message saying she was ill. Several times she placed the phone back down. In the end, she made only one decision. She would attend. Not to interrupt, not to beg, not to change anyone's mind. She only wanted one last chance to see the man she loved. Perhaps after today, she would finally be able to let him go. She chose the simplest dress she owned. It was a long, light blue dress with almost no decoration, no expensive jewelry, no elaborate hairstyle, nothing that would attract attention. She didn't want anyone to notice her. She planned to arrive quietly, watch the ceremony from a distance, then disappear before anyone spoke to her. As she looked into the mirror one last time, she whispered softly to herself, I hope you're happy, Quân. Even if your happiness isn't with me. An hour later, she stepped inside the hotel. The ballroom was already crowded. Music echoed through the enormous hall, while elegant guests filled nearly every table. No one paid attention to the young woman entering alone. Exactly as she had hoped, She quietly walked toward the farthest corner of the ballroom, choosing a place partially hidden behind one of the towering floral arrangements. From there, she could see the stage clearly. Quan stood beneath the crystal lights. Even from across the room, Shaolac noticed something strange. He was smiling, but his eyes looked distant. There was a sadness there that no one else seemed to notice. For one brief moment, their eyes almost met. Quan's gaze drifted toward the corner where Shaolac stood. His heartbeat suddenly skipped. He couldn't explain why. The moment he saw the familiar blue dress, something inside him trembled. A strange warmth spread through his chest. The room around him seemed quieter. His breathing became uneven. Then another guest approached, blocking his view. By the time Quan looked back again, Shaolac had lowered her head. He couldn't see her clearly anymore. Perhaps he had imagined it. The master of ceremonies soon stepped onto the stage. The conversations gradually faded. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced warmly, "thank you all for joining us today to celebrate this wonderful occasion." Applause filled the ballroom. Both families smiled proudly. Quan's parents looked relieved. Trin's parents exchanged joyful glances. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. The ceremony continued. One speech followed another. Guests applauded. Champagne glasses were raised. Photographers captured every smiling face. Throughout it all, Quan remained composed, yet his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He couldn't stop wondering why that woman in the blue dress felt so painfully familiar. Why had seeing her made his heart ache? Why had his chest tightened the moment she entered? The questions refused to leave him. Finally, the host smiled toward the couple. And now, the moment everyone has been waiting for. The exchange of rings. A round of applause echoed through the ballroom. Soft music changed to a gentle piano melody. The lights dimmed until a single spotlight illuminated the stage. An attendant approached carrying a velvet ring box. Trin's smile brightened. This was the moment she had dreamed about. Quan accepted the ring. The small diamond sparkled beneath the lights. He turned toward Trin. Everyone watched in anticipation. Hundreds of eyes focused entirely on the couple. The room became almost perfectly silent. Quan looked into Trin's eyes. She smiled back lovingly, patiently waiting, expecting him to place the ring on her finger. Instead, his hand hesitated. For reasons he couldn't explain, his fingers refused to move. His heartbeat accelerated. The ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. The elegant music sounded strangely distant. Then, a faint sound interrupted the silence. Crack. Barely anyone noticed it. Quan frowned slightly. Another sound followed. Crack. This time, a few guests glanced upward. High above the ballroom, the enormous crystal chandelier trembled almost imperceptibly. One tiny crystal ornament broke free and shattered against the marble floor. Several people gasped. Before anyone could react, the entire chandelier lurched violently. The massive metal frame groaned. Bolts snapped one after another. The elegant ceiling fixture that weighed hundreds of kilograms began falling directly toward the center of the stage. Someone screamed, then another. The peaceful ballroom exploded into chaos. Guests jumped from their seats. Champagne glasses crashed onto the floor. Children cried. People pushed toward the exits. Everything happened within seconds. Quan instinctively looked upward. His mind froze. The chandelier was falling straight toward him. His body refused to move. Time seemed to stop. Across the ballroom, Shaolac saw everything. Without thinking, without hesitation, she ran. Her heels slipped across the polished marble floor as she sprinted through the terrified crowd. People shouted around her. Someone tried to grab her arm. She pulled free. Her only thought was Quan. Nothing else mattered. She reached the stage just as the chandelier came crashing down. Quan! Her voice echoed through the ballroom. Using every ounce of strength she had, Shaolac slammed both hands against Quan's chest. The force sent him stumbling sideways. He crashed onto the stage floor just outside the chandelier's path. The next instant, an ear-splitting crash shook the entire ballroom. Thousands of crystal pieces exploded in every direction. Metal twisted, glass shattered. The sound was deafening. Guests screamed in terror. Quân looked up in horror. Shaolac had not escaped in time. The edge of the falling chandelier struck her shoulder and back with tremendous force before crashing onto the stage beside her. She collapsed instantly. Fragments of crystal scattered across her light blue dress. A deep crimson stain slowly spread through the fabric. Blood. For one endless heartbeat. Everything became silent. Quân stared at her. His breathing stopped. Then panic exploded inside him. Shaolac! The name burst from his lips before he even realized he remembered it. He scrambled across the broken stage, ignoring the shattered glass beneath his knees. He reached her side and carefully lifted her into his arms. Her face had gone pale. Blood stained his hands. "Stay with me." His voice trembled uncontrollably. "Please, stay with me." Just as he held her close, a violent pain suddenly pierced through his head. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He cried out, clutching his temples. The ballroom disappeared. The screams faded. One memory after another crashed into his mind like unstoppable waves. A small apartment glowing beneath warm yellow lights. The smell of soup filling the kitchen. Shaolac laughing as she held up a spoon. "Open your mouth." He smiled and leaned forward obediently. She laughed even harder. The memory dissolved. Another appeared. They stood beneath strings of golden lights on a quiet evening. He gently cupped her face, then kissed her with all the tenderness in the world. She smiled against his lips. Another memory, rain falling outside. Shaolac wrapped her arms around him before whispering softly beside his ear. "Come home safely. I'll be waiting." Another. They lay together on a sofa, talking late into the night. Another. Holding hands while walking through crowded streets. Another. Laughing over burnt pancakes they had ruined together. Then another. And another. Hundreds of forgotten moments flooded back at once. Each one carried the same woman, the same smile, the same warmth, the same love. Shaolac. The woman everyone had tried to convince him was unimportant, had been the center of his world. The memories crashed into Quan's mind with overwhelming force. Each image was sharper than the last. Shaolac laughing as flour covered both of their faces while they attempted to cook dinner together. Her pretending to be angry after he secretly stole a bite from her dessert. The two of them walking hand in hand beneath a sky filled with fireworks, promising they would never let go of each other. The quiet nights they spent talking until sunrise. The countless mornings they woke up wrapped in each other's arms. The way she always waited by the window whenever he worked late. The warmth of her embrace, the tenderness in her eyes, the unconditional love she had given him every single day. None of it had disappeared. It had only been buried. Now every forgotten memory rushed back all at once, breaking through the walls that had imprisoned his mind since the accident. Quân gasped for air as tears streamed uncontrollably down his face. His entire body trembled. At last, he remembered. Not every tiny detail had returned yet, but the most important truth was suddenly crystal clear. The woman lying unconscious in his arms. The woman whose blood stained his hands. The woman who had just risked her own life without a second of hesitation. She was the woman he loved. She had always been the one. His voice cracked as he gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "Shaolac, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology escaped almost like a whisper. It carried every ounce of guilt that had been building inside him over the past weeks. He had forgotten her. He had doubted her. He had watched her suffer while believing someone else's version of the truth. Yet even after enduring all of that, she still chose to save his life. A sob caught in his throat. He tightened his arms around her fragile body as though he feared she might disappear if he let go. "Please don't leave me. Please!" Around them, the once elegant ballroom had become a scene of complete chaos. Broken crystal covered the floor like shattered ice. Guests stood frozen in disbelief. Some whispered nervously. Others called emergency services. Hotel staff hurried to secure the damaged area while security officers guided frightened guests toward the exits. But for Quan, none of it existed anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in his embrace. Several people rushed toward the stage. Among them was Trinh. She had barely escaped the falling chandelier herself. Her expensive white gown was stained with dust, and several loose strands of hair framed her pale face. She stared at Quan holding Shaolac. Then she heard him repeatedly calling Shaolac's name. Something inside her shattered. "No!" She shook her head desperately. "No!" She hurried across the broken stage, ignoring the shattered glass beneath her heels. "Quan!" Her voice trembled. He didn't answer. He was still looking at Shaolac, still gently supporting her head, still whispering her name. Trinh grabbed his arm. "Quan! This isn't what you think. You have to put her down. She's fine. The ambulance is coming." Quan slowly lifted his head, for the first time since regaining his memories. He looked directly into Trin's eyes. The warmth that had once existed there was gone. His gaze was calm, cold, unshakably distant. Trinh instinctively released his sleeve. She had never seen him look at her that way before. "Move." His voice was low, almost emotionless. She blinked. "What?" "I said move." "But Quan, you heard me." His tone became firmer. "Don't touch her." The entire ballroom seemed to fall silent once again. Even the nearby guests stopped whispering. No one dared interrupt. Trin's lips trembled. "You don't understand. She manipulated you. She's been lying to you this whole time." Quan stared at her for several long seconds. Then he spoke with absolute certainty. "No, I was the one who forgot, but my heart never did." He glanced back at Shaolac before continuing. "I don't remember every single day yet. I don't remember every conversation, but I remember enough. I remember who stayed beside me. I remember who loved me. And I remember who I loved." Every word landed like a blade. Trin's face turned completely pale. She took another step forward. "Quan, listen to me. You only remembered fragments. You don't know the whole story." Quan interrupted her before she could continue. "I know one thing." His voice remained steady. "The woman you're asking me to abandon just threw herself beneath a falling chandelier to save my life." He looked directly into her eyes. "And the woman standing in front of me is asking me to leave her behind." The silence became unbearable. No one spoke. No one moved. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Several family members looked completely confused. Neither family had expected the celebration to end like this. Trinh desperately searched for words. Her carefully prepared future was collapsing in front of hundreds of witnesses. She reached for Quan's sleeve once more. "Please, we're engaged. Our families..." Quan slowly shook his head. "No, we were supposed to be engaged." He took a slow breath. Then in a voice loud enough for everyone inside the ballroom to hear, he announced, "The engagement ceremony is canceled." A collective gasp swept across the room. Quan turned toward the guests. "I'm truly sorry." His voice was sincere. "I apologize to both families and to everyone who came here today. But I cannot continue the ceremony. I won't lie to any of you. I cannot promise a future to someone I do not love." Every sentence echoed through the silent ballroom. His parents stared at him in shock. Trin's parents looked completely speechless. The photographers lowered their cameras. Nobody knew how to respond. Quan lowered his eyes toward Shaolac again. She remained unconscious, her breathing weak but steady. Nothing else mattered. He carefully lifted her into his arms. Despite the blood soaking through his expensive suit, he didn't hesitate for even a second. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted from across the ballroom. Quan immediately answered. "There isn't time." He turned toward the exit. "I'm taking her myself." Without waiting for permission, without looking back, he carried Shaolac through the crowd. Guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the hotel entrance. Some watched with sympathy, others watched with disbelief. Several quietly recorded the scene on their phones. None of it registered in Quan's mind. The only thing he could hear was Shaolac's faint breathing. Outside, rain had begun falling. Dark clouds covered the afternoon sky. Quan rushed down the hotel steps while desperately looking for transportation. A taxi had just pulled up near the entrance. He waved frantically. "Hospital!" The driver immediately recognized the emergency. He jumped out, opened the rear door, and helped Quan carefully lay Shaolac across the back seat. Quan climbed in beside her. "Please, the nearest hospital. As fast as you can." The taxi sped away. Rain streaked across the windows. Inside the vehicle, Quan gently supported Shaolac's head against his shoulder. He couldn't stop looking at her face. She looked so peaceful despite her injuries, almost as though she were simply asleep. His trembling fingers brushed lightly across her forehead. "I'm here. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here." His voice broke again. "I remembered. I finally remembered. I'm so sorry it took this long." He leaned closer, resting his forehead gently against hers. "I should have protected you. Instead, you protected me." His tears fell silently onto her hand. For the first time since the accident, he understood the depth of her pain. She had watched him forget everything they had built together. She had endured his distance. She had accepted his confusion. She had even accepted seeing him prepare to marry someone else. Yet despite all of that, when his life was in danger, she never hesitated, not even for one heartbeat. Quan closed his eyes. His chest tightened painfully. "I'll never let you face everything alone again." The taxi finally pulled into the emergency entrance. Doctors and nurses rushed outside with a stretcher the moment they saw the blood. "What happened?" "A chandelier collapsed," Quan answered quickly. "She shielded me. Please save her." The medical team immediately began examining Shaolac. Blood pressure dropping. Possible shoulder fracture. "Prepare the trauma room. Move now." The stretcher disappeared through the emergency doors. Quan instinctively tried to follow. A nurse gently stopped him. "Sir, you'll have to wait here." He looked helplessly toward the closing doors. I'm her family." The words came naturally, without hesitation, without embarrassment. The nurse gave him a sympathetic smile. "We'll do everything we can." The doors closed. Silence returned. Quan stood alone in the brightly lit hallway. His suit was soaked with rain. Blood stained both sleeves. Tiny fragments of crystal still clung to the fabric. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to breathe. Slowly, he slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold hospital floor. He covered his face with both hands. The events of the afternoon replayed endlessly inside his mind. The engagement, the chandelier, the memories, the look in Shaolac's eyes just before she lost consciousness. Every second felt painfully vivid. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. He never looked away from the emergency room doors. Every time they opened, he immediately stood. Every passing doctor made his heart race. Finally, a surgeon walked out, removing his mask. Quan hurried toward him. "Doctor, how is she?" The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "She's stable. The injuries look frightening, but fortunately the chandelier only struck her shoulder and upper back. There are no life-threatening internal injuries. She lost blood, but we were able to control it." Quan closed his eyes in relief. His knees nearly gave out beneath him. "Can I see her?" In a little while. She's still waking up from the medication. Quan nodded repeatedly. Thank you. Thank you so much. The doctor placed a comforting hand on his shoulder before returning inside. Quan remained standing in the hallway, staring at the closed hospital room. For the first time since regaining his memories, hope quietly returned to his heart. Morning sunlight gradually filtered through the hospital curtains, replacing the cold glow of the night with a gentle warmth. Quan had barely slept. He remained in the chair beside Shaolac's bed for almost the entire night, waking whenever she stirred or the nurses came in to check her condition. Several times the nurses suggested he go home and rest. Each time, he politely declined. I'm staying. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty. He had already made up his mind. When Shaolac slowly opened her eyes the following morning, the first thing she saw was Quan asleep beside her bed, one hand still loosely holding hers. A faint smile appeared on her lips. Carefully, trying not to wake him, she gently squeezed his fingers. Almost instantly, Quan opened his eyes. For a second, he looked confused. Then his expression softened with relief. You're awake. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep. Shaolac smiled weakly. You've been here all night, haven't you? Quan nodded without embarrassment. I promised I wouldn't leave. And I meant it. She looked at him quietly, still finding it difficult to believe that everything had changed so quickly. Only yesterday she had prepared herself to watch him become another woman's fiancé. Now, he was sitting beside her, refusing to leave her side. Life truly could change in a single moment. A doctor entered the room carrying her medical chart. After checking her vital signs and examining her shoulder, he smiled reassuringly. Your condition is stable. The fracture isn't severe enough to require surgery. With proper rehabilitation, you should make a full recovery. Both of them let out a quiet sigh of relief. There is one thing, however, the doctor continued. You'll need several weeks of rest. No heavy lifting, no sudden movements, and absolutely no trying to be a hero again. The doctor smiled jokingly. Quan answered before Shaolac could. I'll make sure she follows every instruction. The doctor laughed softly. I can see she'll be well taken care of. After finishing the examination, the medical staff quietly left the room. Silence settled once again. Quan turned toward Shaolac. So, what would you like to eat? She blinked. What? You haven't eaten since yesterday. You must be hungry. She smiled. I'm in a hospital. They'll bring food. Quan shook his head. Hospital food isn't very good. I'll go buy something. She laughed. You still remember how picky you are. He smiled sheepishly. I remember enough. Then his expression grew thoughtful. There are still things I haven't recovered. Small memories, dates, certain conversations. But strangely, the feelings are all still there. He looked directly into her eyes. I don't need my memories to tell me I love you. I already know. Shaolac felt her eyes becoming moist again. Before she could answer, a knock echoed through the room. Both of them turned toward the door. Quan's parents stood outside. Behind them were Shaolac's parents, who had rushed to the hospital after hearing about the accident. For a brief moment, the atmosphere became tense. Quan stood up first. Dad, Mom. His mother walked toward him, her eyes already red from crying. She gently touched his face. Are you all right? He nodded. I'm fine. Then she looked toward Shaolac lying on the bed. Without saying a word, she slowly walked closer. Shaolac immediately tried to sit up. Auntie, Quan's mother gently stopped her. No, don't move. To everyone's surprise, she took Shaolac's hand into hers. Her voice trembled. Thank you. If it weren't for you, my son. She couldn't finish the sentence. Tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. Shaolac quickly shook her head. I only did what anyone would have done. Quan softly interrupted. No, not everyone would. You risked your own life. His father, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Quan, is everything we heard true? Quan understood exactly what his father meant. The engagement, his father paused, was canceled? Quan nodded calmly. Yes, I canceled it. The room became silent. His father looked at him for several long moments. Instead of becoming angry, he simply sighed. I won't ask you to explain everything today. I only want to ask you one question. Quan waited. His father looked towards Shaolac before returning his gaze to his son. Have you thought this through? Quan answered without hesitation. I have. I remembered. Not just my memories, but the life we built together. He gently reached for Shaolac's hand. I love her. I always have. I simply forgot. And now that I've remembered, I'm not letting her go again. His parents exchanged a long glance. Finally, his mother smiled through her tears. If that's your decision, we'll respect it. Shaolac looked at them in surprise. You aren't angry? Quan's father smiled faintly. We were confused. But after seeing what happened yesterday, there isn't much left to question. He looked warmly at Shaolac. A person doesn't risk their life for someone they don't truly love. The tension inside the room slowly disappeared. For the first time, both families spoke openly. There were apologies. Misunderstandings were acknowledged. Questions remained, but no one wanted to force answers while Shaolac was still recovering. At that very moment, outside the hospital, rain had finally stopped. Standing alone near the entrance was Trinh. She hadn't slept either. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. The elegant woman who had confidently prepared for her engagement only yesterday looked completely different now. She stared silently at the hospital building. She knew Quan was inside. She knew he was sitting beside Shaolac. Every minute they spent together made the distance between them even greater. For a long time, she considered going inside. She wanted one final chance to explain herself. One final chance to convince Quan that things could still return to the way they had been. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Quan's eyes, when he looked at Shaolac, were the same eyes he had never once used to look at her. She finally understood something she had refused to accept for far too long. Love could never be forced, not with lies, not with timing, not with family expectations, and certainly not by taking advantage of someone who had lost his memories. A tear slowly rolled down her cheek. She quietly placed the engagement ring box she had been carrying onto a nearby bench. Then she turned around. Without entering the hospital, without saying goodbye, she simply walked away. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because she finally realized there was nothing left to fight for. Back upstairs, Shaolac was laughing softly as Quan struggled to peel an orange. You really forgot how to do that? She couldn't help teasing him. Quan frowned dramatically. I used to be good at this. You were never good, she laughed. You always ended up eating more than you peeled. Quan looked at the misshapen orange in his hand and sighed. Apparently, some memories are better left forgotten. The room filled with gentle laughter. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but after everything they had endured, it sounded like the beginning of peace. Quan finally managed to separate one clean slice and proudly handed it to Shaolac. There, my greatest achievement today. She accepted it with a smile. I'll pretend it's perfect, he laughed, as long as you keep pretending for the rest of my life. She looked into his eyes. I don't have to pretend anymore. There was complete sincerity in her voice. Only love, only trust. Quan leaned forward and gently kissed her forehead. No grand promises, no dramatic speeches, just one quiet sentence. I'm home. Shaolac closed her eyes. For so long, those were the words she had dreamed of hearing again. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Welcome back. Outside the hospital window, the clouds slowly parted. Golden sunlight spread across the city. The storm had finally passed. The road ahead would still hold challenges. There would be difficult conversations, relationships to rebuild, trust to restore, and memories still waiting to return. But none of those obstacles frightened them anymore, because this time, they would face every step together, not as strangers, not as two people separated by forgotten memories, but as two hearts that had found their way back to each other. Sometimes love isn't erased by time, sometimes it isn't destroyed by distance, and sometimes not even lost memories are powerful enough to make two souls forget where they truly belong. For Quân and Shaolac, the journey had never really been about remembering every single moment they had shared. It had been about finding the courage to follow what their hearts had known from the very beginning. In the end, memories returned piece by piece, but love had been waiting patiently all along, and this time, neither of them would ever let it slip away again. Quan's engagement to Trinh seems destined to become reality, even as an unshakable emptiness lingers in his heart. While secretly searching for the missing pieces of his past, he discovers that Shaolac was far more important to him than anyone admitted. On the day of the ceremony, tragedy strikes when a massive crystal chandelier crashes toward the stage. Without hesitation, Shaolac throws herself into danger to save Quân, suffering serious injuries in his place. The shocking sacrifice unlocks Quan's lost memories, revealing the unforgettable love they once shared. In front of stunned guests in both families, he calls off the engagement, rejects Trinh, and rushes Shaolac to the hospital. As they reunite beside her hospital bed, Quân vows to recover every forgotten memory and never let the woman he truly loves face another storm alone.